nuevo campus de UCLA Graduate Art Studios de California y el Menil Drawing Institute. Su trabajo ha sido expuesto internacionalmente y es parte de colecciones permanentes en el Museo de Arte Moderno de Nueva York, el Instituto del Arte de Chicago, el Museo de Arte Moderno de San Francisco y el Museo de Arquitectura de Múnich. En 2017 fueron directores artísticos de la Bienal de Chicago. Recibamos a Marklee.
I'd like to thank Akine for this generous invitation to be here and come and share some of the thoughts, some of the work with you. It was great hospitality when I arrived yesterday that my friend Eduardo took me to Farolito for some tacos. And I haven't been to Mexico City in 15 years, and I had tacos for lunch, and I had tacos for dinner, and I feel like I'm back in Mexico City. I don't know if some of you might know that last year they opened the first Taco Bell restaurant in China. They struggled a little bit in the beginning, but now they're doing well, they're opening more Taco Bells. The problem in the beginning is I think the Chinese had a problem understanding how to eat tacos, so they don't quite know how to approach. So in New York Times, there was an article about this struggle, and then they talked about this Chinese man, this patron, who was at the restaurant with his family, and he didn't know how to eat the taco. So he watched a video that they showed at Taco Bell, and then he said, "Oh, I get it. You have to tilt your head, and then you eat the taco." So he told his whole family, you got to tilt your head, and the whole family tilted their head. I just like that story because it's about like once you know a certain methodology, you can enter the system. I'm an architect, I'm a practicing architect. I'm also a teacher, so I've had my practice for 20 years this year. So I just want to run through some of the projects that I do. I'm not going to really talk about the projects today, but I think being a practicing architect is about production of buildings, whereas being a teacher is about the transference and the production of knowledge. And then oftentimes these two realms and these two directions don't always reconcile or don't always find a certain convergence or a happy convergence. But there are moments when there's certain overlaps begin to actually bring out other things, And so what I want to focus today is a Chicago Architectural Biennial that my partner Sharon Johnston and myself has co-curators or artistic directors of that ran from September of last year until January of this year. When we teach, we often have times to use certain thematics or interests that was derived from our practice. But I think there's also some undercurrents. I think one of the currents is history, the notion of history itself. So for the Chicago Architectural Biennial, the title is Make New History. The title itself is stolen or borrowed from a book by Ed Ruscha. It was an artist book that we had, and every day we look at this book, Make New History. We thought it's interesting not only because it talks about history, but it also talks about the act of making, being something very active. Why history? I think we were participants of the first Architectural Biennial, and we noticed a lot of young practices, a younger practice than ours, that have a very interesting take on history that's different for us from the previous generations. So history is not seen as a remedy for orthodoxy, such as maybe the postmodernists that use it for against late modernism, nor history is seen as something that is a burden, maybe in the way the Beaux-Arts was. But history was seen very much as a horizon, different ways to tap into history. In the book Empire by Antonio Negri and Michael Hart, they talked about this system or this condition that history almost becomes horizontal. We think about today, there's abundance of images and abundance of information. Everyone has access to images and information. And how do you deal with this plethora of image and information? And history, I believe, comes in as a structure that begins to give meaning and give relational logic to all this information that's there. When we think back of the Venice Biennial, I think two biennials that stood out for us. One was Rem Koolhaas biennial, Fundamentals, that dealt with history, that went back into history as a way of thinking forward. And for us, we admire that biennial tremendously. We also think that the way that that biennial is structured has a certain sense of historicism, you know, where everything is fit within this 100-year narrative. The other one that we find interesting was the very first biennial by Portuguese, where history was treated as a kind of as a horizontal horizon where you have different moments of entry points. So you can enter from modernist history, one can enter from Baroque history, but it makes different sense to different architects. So for us, I think today where we are, maybe it's closer to this model and understanding history as a horizon. So when we first came up with this notion of making new history, this prompt, we anticipated different types of responses. You know, certainly there will be architects that dealt with building history. You look back into the history of buildings. Also, some architects look back to a condition before buildings. They look back into a much more primitive or archaic history. There's a history of images, you know, history as representation, not just the buildings themselves, but the mode of representations, the mode of drawing or drafting. There's material history, how materials itself has evolved, and also civic history. So it has to do with scale. So beyond the building itself, the scale of the city also comes into play. When we took on this position as artistic directors, some curators that have done biennials have warned us many things, and two of the warnings that we remember was that you will make a lot more enemies than you will make friends, and that turned out to be true. And the second prediction that a more seasoned curator told us that at the opening day, 100 people will be there, 100 architects, and they'll all come up to you and tell you how great the show is, how great the show looks. Everything looks great except their own piece, which is also true. So we're glad we kind of survived this project that lasted for more than 1 year. But instead of presenting these 4 different types of histories to you as categories or as curators, we like to present them to you as architects, how we thought about how these things are exhibited or how these things are presented within the building itself. One thing we learned from the Strada Novissima of Portuguese is the sense of scale, you know, going to the street itself, that the exhibition begins to approximate the impact of architecture. So not only do you have things that are represented, you know, things like models or drawings on the wall or on plinths, but you actually begin to feel the presence of architecture, something larger than life or larger than the human scale. And at a time when everything is at your fingertip, everything can be transmitted through screens and the internet, I think going to an architecture biennial, experiencing it, and also understanding a much more slow way of consumption is central to us. The biennial happens in the Cultural Center of Chicago. This is an end of the 19th century building, used to be the Public Library of Chicago until the early 90s. It was designed by Shepley, Rutten, and Coolidge. They came up from H.H. Richardson's office. And these are historical photographs. This was very much a place where people met and read the newspaper, borrow books. It was very much a civic center. Since it turned into a cultural center, which is for exhibitions and such, this place is not as visited or used as before, but it's located right in the center of the city. So we begin to analyze the space itself. You know, there are these great rooms, you know, the room with the largest Tiffany dome in the entire world, a room with these glass dome, the great Army Hall, the former reading rooms, these really beautiful, defined Beaux-Arts rooms. And then on the other side, there are a series of rooms that has been transformed into, in our opinion, kind of characterless gallery spaces when it was turned into a cultural center. So these are white wall spaces, not great galleries, slightly odd proportions, but adequate for exhibitions, a typical type of rooms that you will find in a civic center. And then there are all these strange leftover spaces, these transitional spaces, long corridors, and undesirable spaces. In the first biennial, they didn't have enough room for exhibition. Some of the pieces were exhibited in these corridor spaces, and certainly the participants that were in those spaces were very unhappy. So these are the type of ingredients that we have, these really well-defined rooms, these modified gallery spaces, and these leftover transitional spaces. So how do we deal with it? I think the first floor of this cultural center, the gallery spaces. We try to create these type of black rooms, black rooms that are much more immersive, and then have exhibitions hanging around them. So a very defined structure where different thematics begin to emerge, where different architects were also invited to create site-specific installations. So Anna Javoska, for example, a Chicago-based young architect who was always interested in the motifs of classical architecture, whether it be the vault, the arch, the column, but oftentimes abstracted. She designed this room where the information desk is, as well as a series of architectural elements that were devoid of their functional or structural purposes, like columns that didn't support anything, as the main entry foyer of the exhibition. Or Reto Geiser, a Swiss architect based in Houston and teaches at Rice, concocted this room for books. There's 4 quadrants to the room. One quadrant is a bookstore. The other quadrant is the archive, a selected archive from Stanley Tigerman's library that he began to relate his books to his work. A quadrant where the exhibitors' books are published, as well as a quadrant where books are being produced. So throughout those 3 months where the biennial was going on, there are constantly zines that are being Xeroxed, that are being made. Adjacent to it is an immersive exhibition of a video by 51N4E from Belgium with fragments of the square that they're designing in Tirana, as well as Henri Salah's work that he collaborated with. In the central foyer, right past Anna Javoska's foyer, the first entry hall, is a space designed by Frida Escobedo. This is the earliest sketch of her work, and she's interested in the notion of the grid and created this type of platform. And at the end, she created this plinth that starts from 0 and slopes up. And it's built by a series of modulated wedges that over time could change and could be reconfigured. So in the opening day, it was basically a continuous slope. And then over time, it became a series of lower, flatter platforms where chairs and table could be inhabited. So it became a very informal space where lectures happened, where performances were done. Kids were running up and down and sometimes sitting very informally or eating. And right adjacent to it, in the foreground, you see a model by Derek Delacamp. Derek is interested in this notion of the wall, the role of the wall that not only divides, but also can be a wall that connects. And he placed this whole piece right in front of the stair, the main stair that takes you up. So right when you think you have a front axis, you have to walk around and negotiate around the model of this wall. I mean, it's a beautiful model and quite brilliantly cited, I must say. And adjacent to it, there's a room about tectonics and structure. There are 3 towers by Barkov Leibinger from Berlin, where they looked at 3 types of construction systems: the Plattenbau from East Berlin, the prefabricated concrete panels, together with timber and wood construction coming from Tessenov's Festspiel Hall, as well as this notion of thicket coming from, the idea came from Robert Smithson's and Nancy Holt's video of these photographs of these tumbleweed. So they interpreted these 3 models into 3 different types of structures for housing. And in the same room is Stan Allen's work, who has been interested in the balloon frame, who actually came from Chicago. It was called the Chicago frame. And this is an ongoing interest of how a very vernacular type of construction can be the construction material for larger buildings. These are some of the smaller variations of types that Stan Allen has been studying. Or Design with Company has been fascinated with the steel details of Chicago construction. And so they surveyed a series of floor plans, the structural floor plans of these Chicago buildings, and begin to emphasize some of the details and create this almost Soloid type of installation of recombination and reconfiguration of these type of details. In the same room is Toshiko Mori that created a large-scale model of this art center in Senegal that she had designed and constructed. It's very interesting to see how a kind of parametric way of thinking smooth surfaces can be combined with a more indigenous and local way of construction. And right across from that room is a collaboration between Aranda Lash, very digitally savvy and brilliant young architects based in Arizona and New York, in collaboration with a native Indian American craftsman So they created these type of artifacts that is a combination of this digital parametric thinking together with a very traditional way of crafting. And this type of a combination between technology and something very traditional, we also see in other works, such as in China, Aki Union. They have been interested in using robotic ways of constructing bricks, very traditional bricks, or looking at very traditional typologies, but digital ways of conceiving them as well as building them. So you get to see these buildings that are, on one hand, very traditional, that fits within the historical context, but on the other hand, like new, unexpected type of morphology begins to emerge. Also, Zhao's standard architecture in Beijing also begin to study the transformation of the hutong. Or from Italy, Piovini Fabi. This is a young practice. They were fascinated by Franco Albini's metro rail system in Milan in the mid-50s, 1950s, where there's a certain optimism and gaiety with modern architecture. Albini went to all these type of fabricators and the stone manufacturing and also the metal screens that create things that were specifically for the metro rail. Later on, a lot of these materials became ubiquitous material, like the Pirelli floor. This plastic Pirelli floor was actually developed for the metro. Then we see much later on in industrial spaces or kitchens by British high-tech architects. But the Piovini Fabi went back to the manufacturer and found the original materials and began to use those materials for domestic settings. So what was used as the walls became tables. The handrail that was designed between Albini and a graphic designer was transformed into a lamp. Some of the wall panels, the blue wall panels, were built into a locker. So there was this historical dialogue between materials that are being reused in different ways. We also see this in this Greek practice of point supreme. They showed a house with materials that come from various resources, new materials, as well as found objects or savage objects, and they begin to build these totem poles that show the different use of materials, almost like a material palette, right across from the photographs of the house. I think this type of thinking about reuse also happens in the planning of new buildings, such as HHF architects in Basel planning this parking garage at the outskirts. While they plan the parking garage to accommodate a certain amount of cars that are needed immediately, they also know that in the future there will be, with ride-sharing programs, with the way that the whole periphery is changing, they would not need that many parking spaces anymore. So as they plan the parking lot, they preemptively think about how this parking structure, or part of this parking structure, could be transformed into offices and housing. So that substantially changes the dimensions and scale of the parking lot itself. In an urban scale, like this is still very much an architectural scale. In urban scale, you see architects like Dominique Perrault. Besides his architecture work that's known, he has been doing a series of collages where he began to envision what the underground of metropolis would look like, or how could we utilize the underground of a metropolis from New York to Paris. We see Lan architects who is rethinking the Haussmann plan. They study the Haussmann plan and implement it to situations that are of use today, as well as implementing the Haussmann plan onto a series of other cities. AWP architects, also from Paris, were doing a series of maps of the underground infrastructure in relationship to things that were happening above. So all these basically happen in these rooms with these black boxes. So oftentimes these black boxes are immersive case experiences, such as this one by Arno Brandenhuber. Within another black box is Work AC from New York, and they have been studying the transformation of these Jugendstil buildings in Lebanon, and created this whole type of landscape. Or Erich Mateus from Portugal created a video room in one of these black boxes that shows some of the projects that were paused or that were unfinished during the crisis, and how these buildings, as states of ruins, begin to affect the site around them. This is one of the black boxes. This is a collaboration between Jürgen Meyer-Haar in Berlin and Philipp Ursprung, the historian in Zurich, called Cosmic Latte, and they're interested in the whole notion of the color beige, how the color beige both represents in one psyche of war, watching the desert wars on TV, as well as the most benevolent color for public buildings. Just to show the context of also team architects, and also Ludovico Sentis from Italy celebrated the anniversary of the Chicago Pile, the first atomic reactor that was done 75 years ago, with an 80% replica of the first Chicago Pile. There's a floating impenetrable black box that was sitting in the one of the foyers. So that was the first floor. The second floor is a series of what we call salons, these drawing rooms. One of the first rooms is a collaboration between Adam Caruso and the artist Thomas Demand, as well as photography by Helen Benet of Caruso and St. John's models, where there's a huge plinth with a tableau of 5 projects. Some are built, some are not, but almost straddles between a kind of imaginary and a real landscape, with Thomas Demand's wallpaper that covers the entire room, with images of their references that affect them, as well as Helen Benet's photographs. In the adjacent room, you see these 2 towers by Studio Mumbai of Bijoy Jain. Uses a very traditional technique of these ceremonial towers that are used for wedding to create miniature skyscrapers with a backdrop of one-to-one scale sketches by the Portuguese architect Ricardo Back-Gordon. So these are like very extremely lightweight approximation of buildings. And right across, you have Made In from Geneva, and collaborations with the students at the ETH begin to create these collages of improbable spaces where one building is collaged within the other, but if you don't know the building, it looks quite natural, but almost has this kind of Hans Hollein, collaging the battleship onto this landscape, but in a much less shocking way. And then also we have almost 800 drawings of variations of a single type by Peso von Ellinghausen from Chile. It's a very mathematical way of not only thinking about the type of this building with base and tower, but also a series of color variations that at the end, I think there was 795 or 94 of them, was the logical number and conclusion with this formula that they've set up. And in many ways, that the Peso von Ellinghausen's drawings remind us of John Haydock's drawings, from the 70s. Also this axonometric projection. And we managed to show 2 pieces, rather pop pieces, by Stanley Tigerman of that generation of the Chicago-based architect. Right next to Jeannie Gang did a one-to-one scale study of a building of hers that the inspiration came from half timber frame or Tudor-style houses. So for us, seeing this kind of one-to-one scale building, right next to it is Junior Ishigami's large-scale model of a chapel, which is more than 2 meters high. It's a chapel in Tokyo that has an open roof. And when you get closer, you thought it was a sculpture, and then you begin to see the scale figures that are tiny, and you realize how crazy this building is. And then also much more traditional type of representations. Like these are studies of geometric configurations of Baroque churches by Cameron Wu from Cambridge, or Jorge Otero Palaus from New York, who has been doing this series of dusts where he used latex to imprint, make imprints from historical buildings, and some of them are historical for architectural reasons, like the Trajan's Column, and then there's some that has socio-political issues, like this one was from a building that was bombed during the terrorist attack in Norway. You can see the scar of the previous wall and such. So the way that we dealt with these leftover spaces or in-between spaces, we actually wanted to dial those spaces up. Rather than seeing these corridors or leftover spaces as undesirable spaces, we actually commissioned architects to give them a certain character. So on the lowest floor, Paul Anderson and Paul Preisner from Chicago and Colorado collaborated together to create 5 rooms that are an enfilade built out of concrete blocks and clad it with these glazed bricks that are used quite ubiquitous in American public buildings. So in a way, they created this type of really strong hallway, you know, but begin to define the rooms. And also the glazed brick begins to reflect a lot of natural light that brightens this kind of rather dark corridor space. Right above is an installation by So Il, Solid Objectives Edinburgh Lou from New York. It was a leftover from the first biennial, but we wanted to keep appearances of what happened before. And it was a series, it's like a very cathedral-like space in one of these hallways with ramps, but were built out of metal studs. And then on the top floor, Agenda Architects from Medellin created this long hallway built up. This is a study that's built out of these curtains that were imprinted with images of plants from Medellin. You know, so this is the installation. It's really, this corridor was such a difficult space, and they really transformed it into something quite different. On one hand, it is the representation or the images of the vegetation of that neighborhood, but also there's a certain reference to the curtain wall buildings of Mies van der Rohe or early Mies van der Rohe's work. When you walk through the space, you're not right away, you're not quite sure of the images of vegetation or are they marble spaces. And also how these curvature of the spaces create these type of more intimate spaces where you walk in and then you have this one-to-one relationship with the work of a project for a coffee plantation factory that they have designed in relationship to the historical study of the pieces, in relationship to Mies van der Rohe's primitive huts, and in relationship to the landscape that was done by an artist. There's another corridor of the space. We see Pascal Flammer's piece, a very primitive but with a kind of pastel colored pieces standing in the edge to the end of the corridor, and with a wall relief that was done by Andrew Zago from Los Angeles. They've always been interested in the history of color, you know, from Goethe to Corbusier. You know, he was trying to think of like spatial dimensions that can be done through the overlaying of these type of color spaces. The nice thing of doing it in the corridor is that you never really have the chance to step back or the space to step back and see the whole thing. So the piece occupies your entire peripheral vision. So it's a really immersive experience. So for us, it's great to see this piece in relationship to other architects like Elena Manfredini, also from Los Angeles, that were interested in the digitized version of Mies van der Rohe's facades, or Jennifer Bonner from Boston that has been interested in this type of coloration, to maybe a more urban scale, like Keith Krumverdi from New York that has been designing this type of new American suburban development. And in this hallway, he created this type of panorama through the language of very historical architecture. Or one of the most difficult spaces, corridor and leftover spaces, Go Hasegawa here, created a series of drawings done on gold leaf. And this is a space really hard to describe unless you're there. But he put, on the upper left-hand side, there's a clear story light, but he put a very light scrim there. And that light scrim, in relationship to turning off the lights, in relationship to the reflection of this gold leaf, really kind of make that space quite magical. You know, like a space that no one paid attention to before, just wanted to get through it as soon as possible, as quick as possible. You suddenly walk through this kind of dreamlike space with a strange defamiliarization. So we thought like this type of installation was something that we were interested in terms of an experience that you create in the biennial. So there are many other leftover spaces, like this is on top of the stair, where Monadnock architect from Belgium created these two sculptures, Make Big Plans and Make No Little Plans, that were derived from a Daniel Burnham quote. You know, so two of these kind of billboard-like buildings. And then Jan de Wilde of de Wilde Vinktalu, also from Belgium, created a series of column installations that penetrate different types of columns that are non-supporting, that are more space-dividing devices that begin to take on different spaces within the building. Or the design collective Blast, based in Berlin and Paris, and collaborated with Artec, with the furniture that was donated, and begin to create clothes or structures around these furniture. And the pattern of the furniture actually responds not only to the fabric of the material, but also to the room itself, such as the floor pattern as well as the ceiling pattern. So in the more defined rooms, in the real Beaux-Arts rooms, those are the hardest spaces for us to design installations, because no matter what you do is always overshadowed or by these type of strong Beaux-Arts details. So two rooms that we focus on, one we call the Horizontal City, where we invited 25 architects to each choose one photograph of an interior that's important to them or to their work, and we asked them to reinterpret that photograph as a vitrine or as a diorama that represents their work. Now, we gave each of them a volume and a block, but what we didn't tell them was that the configuration of all these volumes was the first iteration of Mies van der Rohe's master plan for IIT. Not only because the master plan for us is a historical legacy of planning that came from Chicago itself, but we are interested in the notion of this kind of vastness of scale between the urban plan and the super intimate scale of the interior. So we begin to see architects like Urban Lab from Chicago begin to picture an image from ArchiZoom or this type of infinitely multipliable space, and they begin to think about how that could be translated. Another architect, Kurmak Ku from Zurich, were interested in this very similar notion of out of Lowe's American Bar, where it's an extremely intimate and introverted space, but the mirrors that Lowe's had used in the clear story area begin to multiply the ceiling. So this notion of forever expansion together with a very intimate and introverted space were similar interests between these two different architects. So these are some of the models that they've done. Or Mayo from Barcelona, they chose this picture of Marcel Duchamp's door that closed on both directions, and they're thinking of the door itself as a piece of furniture, and how they can think about the future house that was just made out of furniture and these doors as thresholds that begin to minimally define a space or an enclosure. So this is an overview of all the installations with Bureau Spectacular in the foreground, interpreting a Lowe's Mueller house covered in fur, or we see like the first office. So it becomes something that seeing the whole space reminds you of Mies van der Rohe's plans, but also necessitates you to look very deeply into these, or very closely and intimately into these installations. Right next to this large installation is a master plan by Sana of an expansion of the Mies van der Rohe campus plan towards the lake. So there's a project that is dealing with the master plan, and then another room with a project that alludes to that master plan. So that was the first room. The second room is an installation we call the Vertical City, which is located at the former reading room, the upper room of the building that has natural light coming in three sides. So what we have done is that we have invited a group of architects to reinterpret the Chicago Tribune Tower competition, another important project that came out from Chicago itself. So besides the architects who were commissioned to rethink the skyscraper, we also recreated two of the skyscrapers. One is Adolf Loos entry, and the other is the one by Ludwig Hildesheimer that was never submitted as an entry. But for us, maybe these two are not necessarily the highest quality, but for us maybe represents the opposite ends of the spectrum, with many great projects in between, like that of Ilios Saarinen's. So here you see these 16, 17 feet, 3 meters tall towers that begin to also form a hypostyle hall, like a one-to-one scale hypostyle hall, while being a scale model of towers at the same time. So on the foreground, you see an installation by the Chicago artist Inigo Magano Ovalle. Next to the Lowe's Tower is a glass brick tower by Moss. And in the middle is a tower by Patricia Barbas from Portugal. On the left, you see the Hildesheimer Tower. In the middle is Sam Jacobs from London. And on the right is Kuhn Melvezzi from Berlin. In the foreground is Charles Waldheim's studies of existing Chicago skyscrapers, but distorted based on different solar priorities. whether it's solar gain for the building or solar gain for its neighbors. Francis Carré in the foreground have been thinking about these public spaces in the middle of the skyscraper that serves the immediate area of the floors that it is adjacent to. And then right next to it is the tower by Productura. Instead of designing a high-rise, they designed two mid-rises that are stacked on top of one another. Two similar but not the same type of buildings. In the center of the room is Tatiana Bilbao. Tatiana created a superstructure and invited, I think she designed like 90 or 190 lots and invited 15 different offices to create buildings that could be plugged in. So in many ways, it suggests that one could think about a high-rise in the same way that one could think about a horizontal planning or think about a street and how that could be done. This is not a tower, but a totem pole by 6A architects. 6A did an interior project in London where they studied the history of that room, and they found out that that room was dismantled one time and moved in the 19th century to Chicago, shown in the Art Institute at the museum as a period room. And then later on in the 1940s, that room was dismantled and shipped back to London and back into the space that they were designing this interior for. And so they're fascinated about the story of this moving from Chicago to London. So they designed this totem pole based on all the moldings of that room. And they sent out invitations to all these wood turners around the US and asked them if they would donate one of these pieces for them. And whatever material they use, whatever finishes they use are completely up to the wood turners. So at the end, this becomes a collective project. And this is an agglomeration of all the wood turners' donation being consolidated together as a totem pole. Anton Garcia Abril from Madrid and Cambridge were interested in pushing the cores of the building to the extremities so that you have a free space in between. Sam Jacobs in London were interested in reusing a lot of the details from John Soane's architecture. I think there were 180 details from Soane's piece in his tower. Or Siri architects from London were trying to build a tower out of these living platforms. At the same time, not looking into Western traditions, but Eastern traditions of creating the simulation of or approximation of a pagoda tower. You know, where they really thought through the details in terms of also thinking about the habitation of how these towers are. Office, Kirsten Gears and David Van Severen were thinking about the lowest common denominator of the palazzo, and they used a series of scale palazzos to create the tower with a mural done by an artist. So at the end, for us, this Perry-style hall is something that works in concert with this incredibly ornate reading room that was there. So adjacent to it, there's some other projects. This one is by historian Sylvia Lavin. She was interested in the notion of models, the role that models play in the evolution of architecture. And the first European museum that was dedicated to architecture is the Frankfurt Architecture Museum, the interior designed by Matthias Ungers, and she recreated the Ungers house-in-the-house model that's morphed into two buildings. And inside that building, there are replicas of the models that were in the original collection that built the museum. And then the original models themselves were being shown at Princeton University, and there's a live feed between Princeton and the biennial. Right adjacent to it is another one-to-one scale room by Balcu in Milan, who collaborated with Stefano Graziani to create their version of the Giotto's chapel in Padua. They created their own narrative of the interior with a series of murals. And right adjacent to it is Dogma, who did a series of brilliant drawings of this one-room space. So for them, that's the lowest common denominator of this one room. So there are rooms of Virginia Woolf's house, or Virginia Woolf's room, or Sigmund Freud's room, to architectural rooms like Hannes Meyer's Existence Minimum. Everything is drawn with a computer, but drawn with these kind of single lines in the manner of Heinrich Tessenow. You know, so there the installations on the interiors as well as the exterior. But I think one thing that we are excited about was that we also invited artists to come and collaborate with architects as well as create certain type of installations, such as Veronica Kendorfer from Berlin, who photographed the Neue National Gallery of Mies van der Rohe under reconstruction or under renovation. So every dust that was on the glass, every construction debris is captured. So something beautiful and utopic, but also dystopic at the same time. And everything is silk screen on glass, and it's leaning. So it reflects the environment that you're in, as well as the space of the imagery of the Neue National Gallery. Or Luisa Lambri from Milan, who has always been focused on the interior space as well as these details. She was commissioned to photograph the Farnsworth House, and she created this series of pictures, and always never singular, they're always serial, and she installed it together to show different times of the day. Or Philipp Scherer from Zurich were taking these photographs, satellite photographs of Chicago buildings, you know, the rooftop of the buildings that are almost abstract, and formed this installation. Daniel Everett from Chicago, who have always long been influenced by the cityscape, the traffic patterns, and or David Shalio were interested in these buildings that are on the outskirts of Chicago that are being demolished, and the whole social history of those buildings. Or Marian Mueller photographed the cultural center, but reinstalled these photographs in unexpected spaces throughout the cultural center, such as these vitrines. And then lastly, James Welling, who commissioned to photograph a series of Mies van der Rohe buildings. And the way he photographed them digitally, but used 60s analogical methods of dealing with color through a digital lens to create these type of photographs. You know, like this one from the Lakeshore Drive apartment. You know. So at the end, James Welling's photographs becomes a frieze around this Beaux-Arts building. So besides the mothership where all the installations are, there are other venues that we try to engage the city, such as James Welling's photograph together with Gerard and Kelly, another artist. Installation was shown in the Water Tower. We had a few installations at the conservatory. This is Francois Perron, who was interested in these air structures right in the center of this greenhouse. Or Philippe Brahm were doing these type of heat-sensitive panels. Or So Ill, together with Anna Privashi, designed these kind of wearable screens for musicians. So every time, for wind musicians, so every time you breathe and blow air, it actually helps, theoretically helps filter the air through the space. So that's it. Thank you very much.